Spoilers ahead. 3 actors played Spider-Man, but only one version actually paid the price. If you compare the emotional architecture of all 3 film series, the reason the first trilogy still resonates more deeply than the others has nothing to do with nostalgia or timing or even the quality of the villains. Sam Raimi's version built Peter Parker's entire arc around a psychological principle that the later films either misunderstood or actively avoided. Responsibility is not a superpower you gain. It is a loss you carry. The moment you stop carrying it, the character stops being Spider-Man. He becomes something closer to wish fulfillment. The Tobey Maguire trilogy gave us a Peter Parker who wanted to be Spider-Man less with every film. That is exactly why it worked. The core tension in his character was not whether he could win the fight. It was whether he could keep sacrificing the life he actually wanted. Every major decision he made across all 3 films reinforced the same brutal truth. Being Spider-Man meant losing the things that mattered most to him, not as a temporary setback, but as a permanent condition of his existence. The first film established this immediately by killing Uncle Ben. The brilliance of that narrative choice was not the death itself. It was that Peter's guilt over Ben's death did not fade or transform into motivation. It calcified into a psychological wound that never healed. Every time Peter put on the mask, he was not becoming a hero. He was reliving the moment he failed to act. The suit became a self-imposed punishment rather than an empowerment fantasy. Compare that emotional framework to the Andrew Garfield version. Uncle Ben's death certainly happened. It certainly mattered. But the films treated it more like an origin checkpoint than an ongoing psychological driver. Garfield's Peter spent most of his screen time enjoying being Spider-Man. He cracked jokes. He performed stunts for Gwen Stacy. He used his powers in ways that felt playful rather than obligated. This created a tonal disconnect between the tragedy that supposedly motivated him versus the actual emotional experience of his character. He seemed to be having a reasonably good time despite the premise. The Tom Holland version went even further in the opposite direction by removing the responsibility framework almost entirely. It replaced guilt with mentorship. It replaced burden with validation. This Peter Parker did not lose someone due to his inaction. He gained a father figure in Tony Stark. His primary emotional arc across the Marvel Cinematic Universe films became about proving himself worthy of that mentorship rather than atoning for a failure. This fundamentally changed what being Spider-Man meant for the character. Instead of carrying a burden, he was chasing approval. Instead of sacrifice being the cost of heroism, success became the reward for heroism. This is emotionally satisfying in the moment, but it removes the entire psychological engine that made the character compelling in the first place. The Marvel Cinematic Universe's approach to Spider-Man represents the most radical departure from the character's core psychology because it inverted nearly every element that defined the original concept. Where the Raimi trilogy isolated Peter Parker, the Marvel Cinematic Universe integrated him into the largest interconnected universe in cinema history. Where the original Spider-Man operated alone, the Marvel Cinematic Universe version had access to Stark technology. He had Avengers resources. He had a support network that extended across the galaxy. Where Tobey's Peter kept secrets that ate away at his relationships, Tom's Peter had friends who knew his identity. They actively participated in his superhero life. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate creative choice driven by the specific narrative needs of a shared cinematic universe. But it meant that nearly every scene in the Holland films operated on fundamentally different emotional logic than what the character was designed to support. Consider the structure of Homecoming. The film opens with Peter returning from the events of Civil War desperate to be called back into action by Tony Stark. His entire motivation throughout the film is proving himself worthy of being an Avenger. When he stops the Vulture on the ferry, the situation spirals out of control. Tony arrives to save the day, then lectures Peter about responsibility. But the lesson Peter is supposed to learn is not about the cost of power. It is about following orders. It is about waiting until you are ready. It is about trusting the adults who know better. The film ends with Tony offering Peter full Avengers membership. Peter turns it down because he has learned he is not ready yet. This is framed as character growth. This is framed as maturity. But psychologically, it is the opposite of what makes Spider-Man work as a character. Peter is not wrestling with impossible choices or unresolvable guilt. He is going through a traditional coming-of-age arc about learning patience. He is learning humility. Those are fine themes for a teenage superhero story, but they are not Spider-Man themes. Far From Home escalated this pattern by making Peter's central conflict about living up to Tony's legacy after his death in Endgame. The film literalizes a mentorship theme by having Tony leave Peter a pair of high-tech glasses with access to a global surveillance system. Peter's arc involves being manipulated by Mysterio into giving away those glasses because he does not feel worthy of the responsibility Tony placed on him. When he finally reclaims the glasses, he defeats Mysterio. The emotional resolution is that Peter has earned the right to inherit Tony's role. He has proven himself. He is no longer the inexperienced kid. He is a real superhero now. The film ends with Peter swinging through New York with his girlfriend Happy. He feels confident. He is publicly celebrated. Then the post-credit scene reveals his identity to the world. It sets up the next film. This is where the Marvel Cinematic Universe structure created a unique problem because the shared universe format required every film to end on a setup for the next installment. The Raimi films could end on ambiguity. They could end on unresolved tension because each film was designed to stand alone even as part of trilogy. The Marvel Cinematic Universe films had to maintain forward momentum for a larger narrative machine. That meant Peter's losses could never be permanent because the next film needed him functional. His relationships could never fully deteriorate because the ensemble cast had to remain intact for team-up movies. His guilt could never calcify into something unresolvable because audiences needed to see him grow across multiple phases. The format itself was incompatible with the emotional logic of the character. No Way Home tried to correct this. The film's entire structure was built around taking things away from Peter. His identity is exposed. His future is destroyed. His relationships put his loved ones in danger. MJ gets attacked because of their connection to him. Ned gets attacked. May is killed by the Green Goblin specifically because Peter chose to help the villains instead of sending them back to die. This is the first time in the Marvel Cinematic Universe trilogy that Peter's choice leads directly to a devastating consequence. May dies in his arms. Her last words are, "With great power comes great responsibility." The film finally gives Tom Holland Spider-Man the Uncle Ben moment that his origin story skipped. But even here the emotional framework is different from the Raimi version. May's death happens in the third act of Peter's third solo film. By this point, he has already been Spider-Man for years. He has fought alongside the Avengers. He has saved the world multiple times. The guilt he feels over May's death is real. It is painful, but it is not the foundational trauma that defines his entire relationship to the mask. It is a tragic loss that happens to an already established hero. This changes the psychological weight. When Uncle Ben died in the Raimi film, Peter was not yet Spider-Man. The guilt over Ben's death was what created Spider-Man. It was the original sin that could never be absolved. When May dies in No Way Home, Peter is already Spider-Man. The guilt over her death adds to his burden, but it does not create the burden. It is grief layered on top of an existing identity, rather than grief that forges the identity itself. The film's resolution reinforces this difference. Peter decides to ask Doctor Strange to make everyone forget he exists in order to protect MJ, in order to protect Ned, in order to protect everyone else he cares about. This is framed as the ultimate sacrifice. He is giving up his relationships. He is giving up his support system. He is giving up his entire life as Peter Parker in order to keep the people he loves safe. The final scenes show him living alone in a small apartment with no one who knows who he is. He visits MJ at her job. He almost tells her the truth, but decides not to because it would put her in danger again. He swings through a snowy New York alone. The film wants us to feel that he has finally become the isolated, struggling Spider-Man from the comics. But the emotional logic is still inverted. Peter chose this isolation. He made a deliberate decision to sacrifice his relationships in order to protect people. That is a heroic act of selflessness. It is not the same as having your relationships slowly disintegrate because you cannot maintain them while living a double life. The Raimi trilogy showed Peter losing Mary Jane not because he chose to let her go, but because the structure of his life made it impossible to keep her. He was late. He was distant. He disappeared without explanation. She waited for years. Eventually, she could not wait anymore. That is a different kind of loss. It is not noble or heroic. It is just erosion. It is what happens when you cannot be present for the people you love because something else is always pulling you away. The Marvel Cinematic Universe version lets Peter make a clean break. Everyone forgets him at once, which means he does not have to watch his relationships deteriorate over time. He does not have to see the disappointment in their faces when he cancels plans again. He does not have to feel them slowly stop calling. He does not have to experience the gradual realization that he is losing them while being unable to do anything about it. The spell erases all of that. It is immediate. It is total. In a strange way, it is cleaner than the alternative. Peter gets to preserve his image in their minds. They will never know he let them down. They will never resent him. They will simply not remember him at all. This removes a specific psychological torture that defined the Raimi version, which was watching the people you love drift away, while being unable to explain why. The film also structures Peter's final choice as redemptive rather than punitive. He is not being punished for a mistake. He is correcting a problem he helped create by bringing the multiverse villains into his world, then trying to save them. His decision to erase himself is framed as taking responsibility for the consequences of his choices. But responsibility in the Spider-Man context is supposed to be about living with consequences you cannot fix. It is about carrying guilt you cannot resolve. It is about making the best choices you can within an impossible situation. No Way Home gives Peter a way out. The spell fixes the problem. It erases the danger. It allows him to start over with a clean slate. That is a resolution. Spider-Man is not supposed to get resolutions. The structure of the 3 Marvel Cinematic Universe films also reveals how the Mentorship theme replaced the guilt theme. Homecoming was about proving himself to Tony. Far From Home was about living up to Tony's legacy. No Way Home was about learning the lesson Tony never got to fully teach him. Even after Tony's death, his presence shaped Peter's arc. The emotional climax of No Way Home involves Peter meeting the other 2 Spider-Men from alternate universes. All 3 of them process their shared trauma together. Tobey Spider-Man talks about how he killed his best friend's father. Andrew Spider-Man talks about how he lost Gwen. He talks about becoming bitter. He talks about stopping pulling his punches. Tom Spider-Man is on the verge of killing the Green Goblin in revenge for May when Tobey stops him. The 2 older Spider-Men literally hold Tom back. They remind him that killing will not bring her back. They remind him it will only make things worse. This is mentorship again. Peter learns the right lesson because 2 older, wiser versions of himself teach it to him. He does not have to figure it out alone through failure, through regret. He has guides. This is emotionally satisfying to watch. Seeing all 3 Spider-Men together validating each other's pain feels cathartic. Seeing them help each other heal feels earned. But it removes the isolation that made the character psychologically coherent. Spider-Man operates alone. That is the point. He does not have a team or a mentor or support group. He has Aunt May. She does not know his secret. He has friends. They do not know his secret. He carries everything by himself because telling anyone the truth would put them in danger or burden them with knowledge they should not have to carry. The moment you give Spider-Man a community of people who understand what he is going through, you take away the specific loneliness that defined his internal experience. The Marvel Cinematic Universe also changed how Peter's powers were framed. In the Raimi trilogy, Peter's abilities came from a random spider bite. He had to figure out how to use them through trial, through error. His web shooters were organic, which meant his powers were part of his body. He could not remove them. He could not turn them off. In Homecoming, Peter's suit is built by Tony Stark. It comes equipped with AI assistance. It has dozens of web formulas. It has tactical options. When Tony takes the suit away in the second act, Peter has to go back to his homemade version, which is framed as a regression. The film treats the advanced suit as an upgrade. It treats the basic suit as inadequate. This creates a psychological dependency on external resources. Peter is not just a kid with powers trying to do the right thing. He is a kid with powers who needs better equipment to be effective. Far From Home made this even more explicit by giving Peter access to Tony's entire surveillance system. By giving him access to Tony's weapon system. The sequence where Peter designs his new suit on the Stark jet while AC/DC plays is meant to evoke Tony building his armor in the first Iron Man film. It positions Peter as Tony's heir. But Spider-Man is not supposed to be Iron Man. The entire point of Spider-Man is that he does not have resources or money or institutional support. He makes a suit in his bedroom. He swings through the city because he cannot afford a car. He fights street-level crime because that is what is in front of him. Giving him access to billion-dollar technology changes the power fantasy. It stops being about what you can do with nothing. It starts being about what you can do when someone believes in you enough to give you everything. The decision-making patterns across all three versions reveal this difference most clearly. Tobey's Peter made decisions that hurt him. He chose not to tell Mary Jane he loved her because being with him would put her in danger. He chose not to tell Harry the truth about Norman because it would destroy their friendship. He chose not to accept help from Aunt May because he did not want to burden her. He chose not to give up being Spider-Man, even when it was destroying him, because people needed him. All of those choices were self-destructive. The films never framed them as noble or correct. They framed them as the only choices Peter believed he could make given his guilt, given his sense of responsibility. The audience could see the tragedy of his situation without the film needing to explicitly tell us it was tragic. Tom's Peter made decisions that other people told him to make. Tony told him to stay out of the Vulture situation. He did not listen, which led to disaster. Nick Fury recruited him for the Mysterio mission. Doctor Strange offered to cast a spell that caused a multiverse fracture. Even Peter's decision to help the villains in No Way Home, instead of sending them back to die, was influenced by May's insistence that he had to try. His most independent decision was asking Strange to make everyone forget him, but that choice was only available because Strange had already offered to fix things with magic once before. Peter's agency throughout the trilogy was limited by the fact that he was positioned as a junior member of a larger system. He was not making impossible choices alone. He was navigating a world where more experienced heroes kept intervening. Andrew's Peter made decisions that felt right in the moment. He pursued Gwen despite her father's dying wish because he loved her. He investigated his parents' disappearance because he wanted answers. He fought crime because it felt good to use his powers. His choices created conflict, but the conflict was external rather than internal. The tension was not whether he could live with what he had done. It was whether outside forces would let him do what he wanted. When Gwen died, it was not because Peter made a selfish choice. It was because he tried to save her. The physics of the situation worked against him. He did everything right, but still lost, which is tragic. But it is not the same as doing something wrong than having to live with the consequences forever. The reason this matters for the character's long-term emotional resonance is that guilt is a more complex emotion than martyrdom or grief. It is more sustainable. Martyrdom has a resolution. You sacrifice yourself and the story ends. Grief has a process. You mourn, then eventually you heal enough to move forward. But guilt is recursive. It feeds back into itself. Every new choice you make is filtered to the lens of the original failure. The character is always haunted, always uncertain, always questioning whether they're doing enough. That psychological state is what made Tobey's Peter feel more real. He never seemed sure of himself. He never seemed like he had figured it out. Even in his moment of triumph, there was an underlying sadness that suggested he knew the cost would keep rising. The other two versions gave us Spider-Men who grew more confident over time. They learned from their mistakes. They became better heroes. That is a satisfying character arc in a traditional sense, but it is not actually consistent with the premise of Spider-Man. The premise is not about becoming a better hero. It is about carrying an impossible burden, then somehow not breaking under the weight of it. The moment the character starts to feel confident, starts to feel capable, starts to feel sure of their choices, they stop being Spider-Man. They start being just another superhero. That is fine, but it is not the same thing. What made the Raimi trilogy psychologically consistent was that it never let Peter escape the cost. In fact, it escalated the cost with every film. In Spider-Man 2, the consequence of his double life was not just guilt anymore. It was the active disintegration of every personal relationship he had. The film forced him to watch Mary Jane move on with someone else. Watch Aunt May struggle financially because he could not help her. Watch his grades collapse. Watch his best friend hate him. The genius of that film structure was that when Peter temporarily gave up being Spider-Man, the movie did not punish him for it. It rewarded him. Suddenly his life improved immediately. He could pay rent. He could focus on school. He could be present for the people he cared about. The film allowed the audience to feel the relief of that choice before yanking it away. This made the decision to put the suit back on feel genuinely tragic rather than triumphant, because we understood that he was choosing the worst life, the lonelier life, the life where everyone he loved would eventually drift away because he could never fully be there for them. The alternate ending that would have been psychologically inconsistent would have been Peter getting everything, getting Mary Jane, getting financial stability, getting Harry's forgiveness, getting public appreciation. That would have undermined the entire premise. Great power does not come with great responsibility as a bonus feature. It comes with great responsibility as a replacement for everything else you wanted. The Raimi films understood that on a structural level. Spider-Man, free despite its tonal problems, despite its overstuffed villain roster, still ended with Peter standing in unresolved ambiguity with Mary Jane. Even in the finale of the trilogy, the film refused to give Peter the happy ending he had been working toward for 3 movies. Instead, it left him standing alone. Still Spider-Man. Still responsible. Still paying. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 killed Gwen Stacy in what should have been the most emotionally devastating moment in any Spider-Man film. Yet the death did not land with the same weight as Uncle Ben's death in the first Raimi film. The reason is that the film structured Gwen's death as a tragic accident rather than a consequence of Peter's choices. Peter did not fail to act. He acted then failed. That is emotionally different. Failure implies effort. It implies bad luck. Inaction implies a character flaw. The original guilt that drives Spider-Man is rooted in the latter, not the former. The film tried to compensate by showing Peter mourning for months afterward, but the emotional arc of his grief was undercut by the fact that the film ended with him returning to being Spider-Man with renewed energy, with renewed optimism. The loss had been processed. It had been integrated rather than remaining as an open wound. That resolution, while emotionally healthy for a real person, was psychologically inconsistent for a character whose defining trait is unresolved guilt. The Raimi trilogy also understood that the people around Peter had to suffer for his choices. It never let him off the hook for that suffering. Aunt May struggled. Mary Jane waited. Harry spiraled. None of them ever got the full truth, which meant Peter's relationships were built on a foundation of necessary lies. Those lies created distance that could never be fully closed. The film showed us that distance in small moments. Mary Jane's face when Peter was late again. Aunt May's confusion when Peter could not explain where he was. Harry's growing resentment when Peter kept disappearing. Those moments accumulated into a portrait of a person who was losing connection with everyone he loved, not because he wanted to, but because being Spider-Man required it. The Amazing Spider-Man films tried to create similar tension with Gwen, but the relationship was framed as passionate, as intense rather than slowly deteriorating. The emotional texture was different. Passion can survive secrets in ways that long-term partnership cannot. Passion can survive absence. The film's decision to kill Gwen before the relationship had fully settled into the mundane reality of Peter's double life meant we never got to see the slow erosion that made the Raimi version so painful. The MCU version solved this problem by simply giving Peter friends who were also involved in superhero activity. Ned was not being lied to or left behind. MJ was not being lied to or left behind. They were part of the adventure. While that made for fun team dynamics, it eliminated the isolation that was supposed to be the emotional cost of Peter's choice. By the time No Way Home erased everyone's memories, the isolation was imposed externally by magic rather than created internally by the inevitable consequences of living 2 lives. That is a crucial distinction. What the first trilogy understood most clearly was that Spider-Man is not a power fantasy. It is a guilt fantasy. The audience's relationship to character is rooted in watching someone punish themselves for a mistake they can never undo. The reason that works emotionally is that everyone has a version of that mistake in their own life. A moment where they did not act or acted wrong, then someone got hurt. They carry that guilt forward. They try to make up for it. They never quite succeed. Watching Peter Parker live out that psychological pattern on a superhero scale gives the audience a way to process their own unresolved guilt through fiction. That is why the character has endured for so long across so many different versions. But the later films moved away from that framework. They did so intentionally. Guilt is a difficult emotion to sustain across multiple films. Audiences in the 2010s and the 2020s were less interested in watching characters suffer. They were more interested in watching characters overcome. The Amazing series tried to make Peter more charming, more confident. The MCU tried to make him more integrated into a larger universe with mentorship, with support systems. Both of those choices made for more commercially successful films. Both made for more broadly appealing films. But they also made for a Spider-Man who felt less like Spider-Man. He felt more like a teenager with superpowers. That is not the same thing. The consistent version of Spider-Man is the one who never stops paying, who never gets the life he wants, who keeps putting on the suit anyway. Not because it makes him feel powerful, but because the alternative is doing nothing. That is the one thing he cannot live with. That is the version Sam Raimi gave us. That is why even 2 decades later, when people think about what Spider-Man is supposed to feel like, they still think about Tobey Maguire standing in the rain, watching Mary Jane marry someone else, knowing he cannot stop it, knowing he chose this, then living with it anyway. That is what the character is. Someone who lives with it anyway.